I hate to be the one to break up what sounds like a lot of very productive conversations, but that is my role in making sure that we go ahead and get started in a timely manner. It's good to see you all. Good afternoon again. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is William Carter, and I'm the Dean of the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. It's a real pleasure to see this tremendous turnout for our Constitution Day program, and I only wanted to share a few brief words of welcome and introduction, and then I'll turn the program over to my colleague, Professor Harris, and to our three distinguished panelists. Today's program is part of how we mark Constitution Day annually at the University of Pittsburgh. It's also part of a topic in particular today that is unfortunately all too timely, given the well-documented recent increase in hate crimes both locally and nationally. As I said, our panelists today have far greater expertise than I do, and so I will be brief and step out of the way to allow us to share in their knowledge. I just wanted to note a couple of things by way of framing the conversation to come. As I've written in some of my own works, the history of the United States shows that private violence was a cornerstone of the institution of slavery and racial subjugation and later apartheid through the Jim Crow regime. That is to say that those who wish to maintain a system of racial subjugation certainly found it helpful to have the machinery of the state on their side, but perhaps a greater part of what allowed centuries of racial injustice to persist was the impunity felt by private actors to use violence in order to enforce a racialized segregationist regime. Indeed, for those of you who are students of history, you may be aware that that level of impunity reached such a height just before the Civil War that noted abolitionist Senator Charles Sumner was beaten nearly to death by another senator on the floor of the Senate for having made his Crimes Against Kansas speech against the expansion of slavery. We know then that private violence is an important part of how our society structures power relationships. The state, briefly I would say the government, enacted a variety of civil rights laws that briefly were rather effective in their initial iteration in pushing back against that sense of impunity. After the Civil War, Congress, pursuant to its 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment powers, adopted a series of federal, civil, and criminal laws prescribing and penalizing hate crimes. The period of enforcement of those laws, however, was all too brief. As you likely know, at the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s, federal authorities withdrew from the South, which then led to a regime of over 100 years of lynching and other forms of racial terror. The relevance of federal hate crimes law today is certainly something that will be explored in the panelists' remarks. I did also want to note, though, that it's not a settled constitutional issue with regard to the constitutionality of federal hate crimes laws. And so there were recently two circuit court challenges, one in the Fifth Circuit, one in the 10th Circuit, that I wrote an amicus brief in, as it turns out, where the James L. Byrd and Matthew Shepard hate crimes acts were challenged as being beyond Congress's power because they expanded hate crimes law to sexual orientation, among other matters. So I fully expect to see both the social and policy discussion about hate crimes continue, but also the constitutional and legal discussion is something that's actively being pursued by the courts now. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce my colleague David Harris, who will in turn introduce our distinguished panelists for today. David, I'm purposefully going to be brief with your introduction so that we can move forward expeditiously. David is the John E. Murray Faculty Scholar and Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. His teaching and research focus on issues of police behavior and regulation, law enforcement, as well as national security issues in the law. David Harris is the leading national authority on racial profiling, and his 2002 book, Profiles in Injustice, broke new ground with regard to law enforcement encounters with minority motorists in particular. He is also engaged in a wide range of law reform efforts, having testified at least 3 times in the U.S. Senate and before many state legislative bodies with regard to racial profiling and related issues. Professor Harris, as you know if you've turned on a radio, is a widely sought commentator on issues of race and the law and has appeared in a variety of national and local publications commenting on those issues. Before he began his teaching career in 1990, Professor Harris was a public defender in the Washington, D.C. area, a litigator at a law firm in Philadelphia, as well as a law clerk to federal judge Walter K. Stapleton in Wilmington, Delaware. So with that, I will thank you all again for coming. I'm very much looking forward to our panelists' remarks, so thank you all for taking the time, and I'll turn it over to Professor Harris. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. I thank Dean Carter for the wonderful introduction. I'm David Harris of the Law School. I am also the host of the Criminal Injustice Podcast, which you can hear on WESA-FM and at criminalinjusticepodcast.com and on iTunes. So we are here today to honor Constitution Day. That, of course, was yesterday, the 17th, the anniversary of our founding document. And each year, the law school, as part of its obligations here at the University of Pittsburgh, takes on the job of creating a way to observe Constitution Day to mark this important anniversary. It's really a special honor for us. It is not a job. It is something that we, as members of the legal profession, can do to serve our broader community and to highlight the work done both at the law school and, as you will see, in the community at large and in the University of Pittsburgh as a whole, all of the work done to illuminate, protect, defend our Constitution. And as the Dean said, this year it seems an especially important topic. We've seen an unquestionable rise in the public expression and visibility of hate, racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism. The events in Charlottesville were perhaps the starkest, most recent reminder of the magnitude of the challenges that we face on this score. Now, there are many important questions that we take on when we talk about issues like hate and hate crimes and how the system and the Constitution deals with them. But here, for this event, we will be talking about some very specific things. We'll be talking about meeting these challenges through the tool of the federal law. We'll be talking about the organization of hate and how that organization works, and about how we can empower individuals to meet these very important challenges. And we have speakers who are just the absolute right people to talk about each of these topics. Let me just take a minute and set the scene by giving you some very important terms that we will no doubt hear come up today. When we talk about the Constitution and our First Amendment, the one that protects free speech and assembly and so forth, a prime value for our country, we are talking about limits on actions of government. It's very important to remember that. Now, there's plenty government can do and not do, but there are limits on government in the First Amendment. The First Amendment, for instance, does not apply to Google when it decides to fire one of its employees, very high-profile thing that happened a couple of weeks ago. Second important term, hate speech. All right? Speech or other communication that contains hateful messages maybe based on racism, hatred of particular ethnic groups, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, things like that. In the United States, this kind of speech, as odious as it may be, gets protection from the First Amendment, which is to say it is protected as against many types of government regulation and intrusion. Third important term, hate crimes. I'm going to have a lot more to say about all of these things, particularly this one from our first speaker. Hate crimes are actions which can include physical harm to people, destruction or damage to property, specific criminal threats, all of which are, to quote the Department of Justice website, I'm not going to steal Sue Song's thunder here, just a few words, they are motivated by animus based on race, color, national origin, religion, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability, close quote. Now, states can have their own hate crime laws. We have one such law here in Pennsylvania, but they are often different and often narrower than the federal law that I just quoted to you. So that's where we're going. We have some very, very good speakers here for you today, people on this panel who are the right people to talk to us about this very important set of issues. Let me introduce them now in the order in which you will hear them speak. Sue Song, she is immediately to my left here, is the acting United States Attorney for the Western District of Pennsylvania. She oversees all criminal prosecution and civil and appellate litigation pursued on behalf of the United States in the 25 counties that comprise the Western District. From October 2010 through November of 2016, Ms. Song served as First Assistant United States Attorney to U.S. Attorney David J. Hickton, one of our Pitt Law alums. Ms. Song helped to establish the Veterans Treatment Court of Western Pennsylvania, one of the first federal courts of its kind. She also strengthened protocols for crime victim notification and also for advocacy and restitution in federal court, including for corporate victims of cyber intrusions. Ms. Song is going to discuss with us the federal prosecution of hate crimes and other bias crimes such as cross burnings. Welcome, Sue. Dean Kathleen Blee, the next person over on the panel. Dean Blee is the Betty J. and Ralph E. Bailey Dean of the Dietrich School of Arts and Sciences here at Pitt. Dean Blee joined the University of Pittsburgh sociology faculty in 1996. Among her many scholarly articles and books, and I do mean many, Dean Blee published the book called Inside Organized Racism, Women in the Hate Movement. That was published in 2002. And her latest book, Understanding Racist Activism, Theory, Methods, and Research, will be published this year in 2017. She is going to speak to us about how racist organizations and groups promote racial violence. And our third speaker, all the way at the end, is Mr. Cory Saylor. Mr. Saylor is the National Director of the Department to Monitor and Combat Islamophobia at the Council of American Islamic Relations. Mr. Saylor is an expert in legislative advocacy, media relations, and anti-Islam prejudice. His recent reports have concerned details of anti-Islam bias incidents from 2013 through 16, and those reports, other ones, have documented the funding and impact of Islamophobic groups in the United States. He's a regular voice in the United States and international news outlets, ranging from Fox News to CNN, the BBC, the New York Times, and Al Jazeera. In the last several years, Mr. Saylor has helped to spot and remove biased and inaccurate materials from law enforcement counterterrorism trainings. He is going to talk to us about empowering the targets of biased crimes and incidents. Before we start, just a minute about our format. We'll begin with each of our distinguished panelists speaking for approximately 10 minutes. When that time is up, I'll ask each one a single follow-up question based on what they said, and then we'll move to the next speaker for their 10 minutes. When that first round is finished, I'll put some questions to the panel or to individual panelists. And during this time, I'll ask each of you to hold all the questions that they're generating, write them down if you think you might forget them, because at about the 50-minute or 1 hour point, we'll go to audience questions. We have roving microphones. You'll all have a chance to get your questions in, and when we take questions, we'll turn to you in full for all of that. We'll want to get as many questions in as we can, so please remember to think in terms of brief questions. So with that as an introduction, let us start. We're going to start, as I said, with Acting United States Attorney Sue Song, and she's going to talk to us about the federal prosecution of hate crimes and other bias crimes such as cross burnings. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, David. Let me preface this by saying I can assure you I will be broad and not particularly deep. I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to try to cram in a lot of information. Prior to November 2016, I was a career prosecutor. When the presidentially nominated U.S. attorney is confirmed, I will again be a career prosecutor. But for the time being, I oversee the federal prosecution in the 25 counties in the western part of Pennsylvania. With me, I have to say, is Tamara Collier. She's seated at the table here. She is our community outreach and diversity coordinator and spends every minute of her day, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and evenings in western Pennsylvania, meeting with people, talking with people, and trying to prevent crime. My lens is as a person who has prosecuted violent crimes and sex crimes most of my 20-year career. I've lived and worked on Indian reservations in Arizona and South Dakota. I'm the child of an immigrant, and so those experiences influence my view of federal hate crimes. We're going to talk about the federal prosecution of hate crimes, and I'll talk about Dylan Roof particularly later, what you should take away from this is that there is narrow application and they are very technical crimes, and they simply are not likely practical for the prosecution of the vast majority of crimes of violence that occur. So for example, my office will file maybe 500 or 600 criminal cases this year. Allegheny County will file 20,000. So the expectation and the hope is that the state level will be able to adequately address hate crimes, but there's some very good reasons why we would address it federally. Sometimes we need to address it because the penalties are just not appropriate at the state level. Sometimes the state level does not have adequate resources. Maybe you have interstate crimes, maybe you require the use of some of the federal investigative tools in order to bring a person to justice for a crime of hate. Sometimes the local jurisdiction either willfully or negligently just isn't equipped to adequately address the hate and the bias that has taken place in a criminal act. And that's when it is particularly appropriate for federal prosecution. What we're talking about are crimes against persons or property. I think David sort of prefaced to you. I'm going to focus today on crimes that target places of worship and people who are engaging in worship, as well as other crimes of violence that are focused on the way a person looks, be it their skin, their perceived religion, their nationality, sexual orientation, or gender identity, as well as physical disability. There are a lot of statistics about hate crimes, and I can tell you right now they're incomplete and they're probably wildly underreported. Why do we care about hate crimes? Why are we sitting here? Because we think that probably 250,000 crimes a year would be categorized as hate crimes in the United States. Think about that. I mean, that is a staggering number. And how many are officially reported to the FBI as hate crimes? You know, we're talking thousands. So there's a big disparity between what we believe is happening to people and what's being reported, and I can just tell you that we know that's a problem. The Bureau of Justice Statistics anticipates that probably 4% of violent crimes are probably what we would consider hate crimes. I know that there has been a recent report in 2017. This is a pie that broke down sort of what kind of hate crimes we're talking about in 2015. I have seen that in 2017, racial animus is probably 48% of the time, 35% of the time it's ethnicity, and 22% of the time sexual orientation. So roughly similar, but a little different from that pie. We're going to talk specifically about hate crimes against Muslims in the United States, and I'm going to leave it to Cory to talk more specifically about that. But what we know has happened since 2014 is that if the arrow were to continue on its path, it would be going up. What you see, notably, is the spike post 9/11, and we're still sort of dealing with the reverberations of the 9/11 event and how it has impacted that particular community. The statutes I'm going to very briefly talk about are those that you see there. We're going to talk about the Shepard-Byrd Act, as Dean Carter called it, and we're also going to focus on the Church Arson Prevention Act and interference with housing. This is a case that affected me personally. I was an assistant U.S. attorney in Arizona at the time of 9/11. On September 15th, a man went out looking to kill Muslims, and he ended up shooting Balbir Singh Sodhi, who was in fact a Sikh, who was a gas station owner in Mesa, Arizona. There was no federal Shepard-Byrd Crime Act at that point. And even though he was prosecuted, the shooter was prosecuted at the state level. I think it was a reminder that post 9/11 we were going to have a lot of conduct that we needed to take very seriously and address federally. So what took almost 10 years to pass, it was not until 2009, the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Hate Crimes Prevention Act. And the reason that those two individuals were chosen, I don't know if you remember the particular crimes, they're very graphic, you can look them up, I won't spend a lot of time. But Matthew Shepard was targeted because of his sexual orientation. And at that point in time, in 1998, there was not a federal way to address that through a hate crime statute. James Byrd, it was just a horrific death. He was dragged by individuals who were professedly, avowedly, openly racist and white supremacist. And at that time, because of some of the technicalities in the federal law, he could not be prosecuted as a federal hate crime either. Ultimately, his perpetrators were prosecuted at the state level. These are very technical statutes, and I will just tell you that there are sort of two different authorities for these statutes. The first is that Congress has the power to implement the 13th Amendment, which did away with slavery. And so the Shepard-Byrd Act, in part, can address conduct that is racially motivated that we believe to, flow from Congress's authority from the 13th Amendment, to implement the 13th Amendment. Congress also has commerce power. And that is why the technical aspect of these statutes, sometimes we need to show that there's a connection to interstate commerce. Sometimes to bring a federal charge, we need to show that, hey, that gun that was used traveled in interstate commerce. Or you know what, this crime occurred on an Indian reservation. Or this crime occurred at the VA, a place where we have other federal jurisdiction. So very technical. The first prosecution was actually brought by a prosecutor in our office. This was in Alpena, Arkansas in 2010. This was a gas station exchange. There were men who started harassing 5 Hispanic men, started calling them, and I excuse my language, but this came from the case, fucking beaners, wetbacks, telling them you Mexicans need to go back to Mexico. These words were important because that is how we were ultimately able to show what motivated this attack. To make a long story short, those men were pursued, and the defendant in this case, Maybe was his last name, ended up ramming their truck and driving them off the road, and it exploded into fire. Amazingly, the 5 victims survived, but they were seriously, seriously wounded. But this was the first time the Shepard-Byrd Act was brought here in Arkansas. We need to show that this would not have happened but for the animus towards those individuals, and that can be very challenging. But social media helps, tattoos can help, people may publish their views. Those are the types of indicia that we would look for. I will tell you that in May of 2017, for the first time, Joshua Valum was sentenced to 49 years imprisonment because he targeted an individual because she was transgender. And that was the first time Shepard-Byrd was used in a case like this. Dylan Roof, it's a notorious recent case. He is the first defendant who targeted African Americans in that church shooting and who was sentenced to death federally. Like I said, I'm going to fly. We also charged the church arson statute in that case. This is for discussion, I think, and frankly, my colleagues can talk about this. We have a problem in Pennsylvania. There's no doubt about it. We have a number of hate groups here. And I put this slide in here because I think what's happening today, this was a local case that we handled in my office. Emerson Bigali began, you can see him as a young boy actually, with Nazi regalia and paraphernalia. What happened solely on the internet as he sat in his home, online on the computer, is that he ended up becoming an Islamic terrorist and ended up fantasizing and in fact planning to kill people in the United States. So to me, it's how hate can morph into terrorism and how we need to talk about those two concepts. This is the first case that we filed in the Western District of Pennsylvania. This was sort of a notorious subway assault. It was the Kenny Chesney concert in 2015. Ryan Kyle and a number of other people attacked the victim on the subway. There was a video that documented it. They at one point had thrown him on the tracks, and you can imagine the tragedy had a train come at that moment. He pled ultimately to the federal charge and a state charge, and he was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment. This is the second case that we filed in the Western District of Pennsylvania. This is an individual who was at a Red Robin at South Hills Village, and he targeted a person that he believed mistakenly to be Muslim. It was actually a victim of Indian descent, began using a number of ethnic and racial slurs and assaulted him, and that is pending trial. Very quickly, the Church Arson Prevention Act, you might be surprised to know, does not require a church, and it does not require arson. We can prosecute... It's wonderful. It was passed in 1996, but we can target activities that are focused on a place of worship or people who are engaging in worship. This was a case, this was a firebombing that occurred in January of 2017. Hate crime, federal hate crime was charged against defendant Perez this year. There was no insurance for this particular mosque. This is another case from a neighboring district. A man broke into the mosque and burned prayer rugs and caused significant damage. He was prosecuted federally. We could, if we could find the perpetrators, address this type of conduct, turning over headstones in a Jewish cemetery, again, under the church arson statute. And I am out of time. I am going to highlight just one other. The Fair Housing Act is a way that we can get at cross burnings. We know that burning a cross is a way to threaten an individual. And so this is actually a case of mine in Indiana County. 3 individuals spent all day, they were drinking, but they spent all day building a 6-foot-tall cross that they eventually burned in the front yard of a family that had adopted a biracial child from Pittsburgh, actually. They were all sentenced to some time in prison. And the only other thing that I will say is that the state trooper who responded, who was in earnest and trying to do the right thing, did not seize the cross, ended up disposing of a lighter that was found on scene, and again, wrote his report in good faith that it was a prank. And so this is an instance where when we learned about it, we investigated it federally, charged it federally, and got the result that we did. But I think that we need to continue education of law enforcement on hate crimes. And I am done.
Thank you, Sue. I think if there's anything that's most striking about what you've just told us and shown us, it's how much local action you have seen. And I wonder if you could comment on that, whether the Western District of Pennsylvania is the same, different, stands out in any way, and whether state law has been used to go after any of these.
I can tell you that, I don't think Western Pennsylvania, although there are some alarming estimates of the number of hate groups we have, I don't think we're anomalous in the terms of federal hate crimes prosecutions that we bring. But I think it is very apparent that particularly outside of metropolitan areas, we have a lot of bigotry, a lot of hate, and people who are willing to act upon those sentiments either with violence or with cross burnings and things like that. In terms of the state prosecution, there is an ethnic intimidation statute at the state level. I can just tell you that my state prosecutor colleagues deem this to be somewhat imperfect to address the full panoply of activities that people engage in that are criminal here in Pennsylvania. I know there has been a lot of talk of reforming it. To me, it looks more like a sentencing enhancement, and it does not cover sexual orientation, to my understanding.
That's right. So for those of you who want to think about the Pennsylvania statute, it does not go beyond, race, national origin. I'm not seeing it here, but it's all up there. It does not touch gender identity, sexual orientation, anything like that. So it's something that we might think about going forward. Thank you very much, Sue. We'll now hear from Dean Kathy Blee. She's going to talk about the organization of hate. Go ahead.
So what I want to talk about are hate groups, so white supremacist groups and other kinds of racially organized hate groups like the Klan, neo-Nazis, and those kind of groups. So, and one thing to know about this is that most hate crimes are not committed by hate group members, but at the same time, hate groups have a very large effect in generating hate crimes in two ways. There are a number of hate crimes that are committed by people who are loosely called lone wolves, which are people who imagine themselves to be part of a racial or white supremacist movement based often on their interactions with the internet. So these are people who may never have actually gone to a meeting or met somebody who's a white supremacist, but want to act on behalf of this movement that they know through internet and social media. And beyond that, hate groups have an effect in provoking and organizing and channeling violence in the population as a whole. And I'm going to talk about 4 ways that they do so. So one of the ways that hate groups promote or stimulate hate violence that goes beyond their own borders is literally by producing racial hate. So there is certainly a baseline of racism and anti-Muslim sentiment and anti-Semitism in the population, but hate groups are extremely effective in producing and exacerbating that and making it into the kind of hate that compels some people to act violently. And that's, in recent years, has taken 3 directions. One is that hate groups in the United States recently have been very interested and effective in stirring up anti-Semitism. So anti-Semitism in the population as a whole, measured different ways, had gone down over time relatively steadily, but in the hate movement, in the white supremacist movement, anti-Semitism has become more and more significant. So as it became less significant in the population as a whole, it became more significant in the hate movement, who became more and more influenced by European neo-Nazism. So the kind of old-style Ku Klux Klan movement in the United States has been taken over very dramatically by neo-Nazi ideas, and anti-Semitism is very core. They've also been very effective in stirring up Islamophobia and making Muslims an enemy, and an enemy whose eradication is seen as important. So it's not just stirring up animus toward a group, but stirring up the kind of hatred that makes some people want to take action. And finally, anti-immigrant sentiment as a whole, especially, of course, people who are immigrants from Africa, Latin America, and Asian countries. Hate movement's been very influential in focusing hatred toward these groups. And there is a ideology that's percolated through the United States hate movement that's been very effective in stirring these kind of ideas up. And it's a convoluted philosophy, but in general it argues that people who are not white are descended from beings who are before Adam, so they are non-human, and only whites are human, and a belief that Jews are literally the descendants of Satan, of the devil. So this is a very extremely pernicious and dangerous ideology that's become quite widespread in the hate movement, and that if you come to believe it, really compels you to take violent action against people who are the devil on earth or essentially non-human. It's really a terrible turn that has provoked a lot of violence. Secondly, hate groups stir up violence by promoting conspiratorial ideas. So among the most common are, first, that there's a race war. So hate groups argue and are convinced and convince other people that there actually is a war between whites and non-whites that's just over the horizon, that we are already in battle, and that whites need to take up arms, essentially, act to defend themselves against this race war. They also argue that Jews control not just the economy, not just the media, not just the political establishment, but that Jewish control in the United States is so strong that Jews control the federal government and, in fact, are able to control many of the things that affect you in your daily life, the educational system, the legal system, and so forth. Third, hate groups are effective in promoting racial hate crimes by valorizing violence. So hate groups spend a lot of efforts in making violence seem attractive. In fact, violence is a lure that hate groups use to bring people into their groups. So one of the things that I found in the study is that people, especially young people, will join hate groups without any particularly strong racial hatred at all, but a great attraction to being in a group that does violence. So violence becomes the lure, the excitement, the pull into these groups. They also valorize violence as strategic, that violence is a strategy to a goal, that it's essential if we're going to get to the goal of preserving white supremacy, creating a white agenda, that it only can be accomplished, they argue, through violence. And finally, they valorize violence by making it seem inevitable, that whether or not you see yourself as a violent person, whether or not you've ever thought about being violent, that violence is the only option for the white race. And so all those kinds of ways of thinking not only valorize violence, but make it seem imperative and necessary. And finally, hate groups promote or stimulate violence by linking together in networks people who have very different kinds of agendas and allowing them to share ideas and sometimes share resources like guns and money. So that they link together people who are essentially not particularly racist Second Amendment absolutists, people who are not particularly racist militias, with white supremacists, with neo-Nazis, with the Klan, with Citizens Army, with New World Order people, and with this sort of amorphous group that the media has called the alt-right. So these are people with very different kinds of politics, very different agendas, and very different stances toward violence. But one of the things that we saw clearly in Charlottesville was the result of bringing together those groups not only in a common effort, but in a common place where they acted violently together, where they could see themselves as having a common understanding, a common strategy. And so hate groups, even if they're not the majority of those groups, they're very effective in knitting together coalitions that themselves become arenas for violent racial actions. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dean Blee. Just as a follow-up, I mean, you've been writing about organized hate for some time. I mean, the one book was from 2002. It's hard to believe, I know, that there was a time before the internet, but how has the internet really changed this? Has it speeded it up? Has it made it stronger? What's been the impact?
What the internet's done to the hate movement is it's changed it, like it's changed many kinds of political movements, from being primarily groups of people who meet face to face to being a smaller core of people who meet face to face and a much larger group of people who are on the fringes of it or in and out of it, or sometimes are affected by the hate groups purely through the social media or through the internet. So it's in a way it's had a dissolving effect on the groups, but in another way it's extended their reach considerably. One thing that the internet has not done, it's not helped these groups recruit. So people will often say, well, the internet's a great recruiting tool, but actually it's a terrible recruiting tool for these groups because hate groups, don't have an office. I mean, you can't just go sign up. So you join these groups because you're recruited and somebody vouches for you. So it's not particularly an effective recruiting tool, but it's a very effective idea spreading operation, and it's very effective in channeling violence and the ideas of violence in a wider range across the population.
Thank you. We'll now move to Mr. Cory Saylor, and he's going to talk about empowering the targets of bias crimes and incidents. Mr. Saylor?
So first of all, thank you all very much for being here today. I'm glad to be out of D.C., but we need to have an audience every time I come out of D.C., so I really appreciate you all making time out of your day to come and listen to us. And I always worry that those of us in the field that we work in, dealing with hate crimes, are some of the most depressing people in the room, and I hope we haven't depressed you too much so far. So before I go into my main remarks, I do want to remind you of something that I find very encouraging. The U.S. Constitution is an amazing document, but is flawed because it was written by human beings. And the Constitution, as written, counted African Americans as 3/5 of a human being and did not give women the right to vote. We solved the problem of African Americans not being counted as human beings through blood during our Civil War. Or brought the problem to a newer level, shall we say. We mostly dealt with the problem of women not being able to vote in 1920, when women were given universal suffrage. So although things may seem difficult and things may seem flawed at times, I would argue to you that our nation tends to evolve toward the better. We have troubled moments without a doubt. We will talk about some of that trouble throughout the course of this conversation, but I am a longtime optimist that we tend to be able to overcome these difficult periods because I've seen it in our history. We always have struggles, but we've been able to overcome most of our major problems. And I would argue to you that the current tension that we are experiencing today is not the product of Donald Trump, as much as everybody wants to blame him solely for it. I would say we started seeing this stress right after the inauguration of Barack Obama. The people at the Southern Poverty Law Center who track white supremacist groups saw a rise in white supremacist organizing. We at CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, saw a rise in anti-Muslim organizing around about that time. So really it sort of has taken on a focus now, and I would say we are in the crisis, but it didn't just start yesterday. I think what's new about it, though, is that we have in the White House now someone who has specifically incited violence. So I'll point out just one example in February 2016 at a rally, and I want to thank Sue for dropping the F-bomb earlier, because that means the word I'm about to use isn't quite as bad in your eyes now. But at a Trump rally, he, speaking from the podium, Trump talking about people who might throw fruit at him while he was speaking, said, encourage the audience to knock the crap out of them. And if the audience members did that, he then said, I will pay your legal fees. So that is unique to me in this moment, that we have a president who is willing to go to that place on more than one occasion. There is also the uniqueness of the anti-Islam animus that has been expressed by this president. So be it him saying, I think Islam hates us, to his supporting the unconstitutional notion of Muslims carrying special IDs, to his Muslim ban, which is still being litigated at this point. And I say all of that because I lead into the hate crimes data because I want you to see something that has happened since this administration has come in. But the main thing about the hate crimes data, yes, the tension started back in 2009, but what we saw is that the real sort of rise in violence, although it started around 2010 when it targets the Muslim community, what we saw in 2010 was people arguing against the construction or expansion of mosques. By 2014, what I saw, hate crimes were not in the top 5 types of incidents that we documented when Muslims were targeted. But 2015, hate crimes in the top 5. 2016, hate crimes in the top 5. Now in the first half of 2017, hate crimes are number 2 type of thing that we document, those targeting the Muslim community. The only thing it follows is harassment. And harassment we define as acts that are perfectly legal but are anti-Islam in nature. So if you go to a mosque and you say you all are terrorists, totally protected by the First Amendment, but that is harassing people based on their faith. This year, the first half of this year, we saw a 91% rise in the number of hate crimes that we documented. So when I say we documented, that means they were called into CARE caseworkers and reviewed by our caseworkers. So a 91% increase over last year. Overall, anti-Muslim bias is up 24% so far in the first half of this year. But here's where I thought pointing out the notion of where our current president has gone is important in this moment. In the first quarter of 2017, 23% of the anti-Muslim cases that were called into us involved Customs and Border Protection, involved the government. So we stand in a moment where it is possible for someone who has clearly expressed anti-Islam bias to use the instruments of government to target the community. And we know they've tried through the Muslim ban. Those of you who didn't see Rudy Giuliani's interview, he was a Trump campaign advisor, and he said Trump came to him and asked him, how do I legally implement a Muslim ban? So there is an understanding that there are laws between them in the implementation of these things, but there is a desire on some people in this administration to implement these things. So if you weren't depressed before, I hope I've done my job correctly. So what are you going to do about it? I think that's what's really, really important to all of us in this room. And the first thing I want you to understand when you're dealing with hate, when you're dealing with bias, is there's something called confirmation bias. And that is that we all seek to have reinforce the things that we already believed. Very easy to understand. If you are a progressive and you watch Fox News, you're going to get mad really quickly because they're not confirming the things you think. If you're a conservative and you watch Fox News, you tend to agree with it. Watch MSNBC if you're a progressive, you'll find yourself nodding your head because they're saying things that you agree with. If you watch Fox News, you're going to have disagreements with it. And I say that because you want to make sure when you're dealing with somebody who's full of hate that you're not just simply saying things that you agree with but may not be in line with what they're thinking. And I find that all the time when I'm talking to people in hate groups. If I say to them, look, Islam is peace, I get cussed out every time because I'm not confirming what they've seen on TV. If I say to them, look, we're both patriots, I really love America. I love America so much that our fight and our organization's fight against ISIS, that group has added my boss to a short list of Western Muslim leaders they want to see assassinated. So I know I'm doing something right if people in Syria and Iraq are hating on me. So that idea tends to work better. If you're an individual who cares about what's going on right now and you talk at the dinner table with your family, please join the movement. Find a group that you agree with who's working on civil rights and join your voice with them. At the dinner table, you're important. If you're working with an organization, you magnify that. I also want, as I'm speaking to lawyers, we need your help. Every civil rights group I know is overwhelmed at this point in time. We need the expertise that's in this room to help us litigate a number of the things that we're dealing with. I also, to keep it really tight and short, want to point out a couple of last things. When you're in a situation dealing with hate or dealing with bias, no one in this room can describe to you the adrenaline rush you get when somebody who's full of hate starts screaming at you. None of us can talk about the adrenaline rush you will feel when you see somebody pulling a Muslim aside in the line and saying it's because of your headscarf. However, though you may feel that rush of adrenaline, you must remain calm. We want you to assert yourself. We want you to assert your rights in a calm fashion. We want you to unapologetically be yourself. If you wear a headscarf, don't take it off. Keep it on. If you have some other thing that expresses your identity, don't change yourself. But we want you to remain calm when you're engaging with people who are hating on you because of it. We want you to listen to what they're saying, find some commonality between the two of you, which can be really difficult. But like I said, I usually go with the look, I'm a patriot too, I really care. That somewhat lessens the cuss words that are being thrown at me. But by engaging them in that kind of a conversation, I have found that after a little bit, what happens is the deluge that's coming at me slows down, and we begin to be able to have an opportunity to have a real conversation. It is a very, very difficult thing to get to. The last thing that I want to point out, many of us have seen bias incidents happen in front of us. We have heard about what happened in Portland to the people who tried to intervene. That is a very rare thing. Normally, your intervention is the most important thing possible. But because everyone else in the room is watching this same thing, and they're waiting for someone to step up. And once you do, you will find support behind you. But in that intervention, what you usually want to do is not focus on the hater, but focus on the person who's the target of it. Boston just did a really good series of posters in which they told people, look, go to the person who's being hated on, engage them in a conversation on anything random, and just simply ignore the person who's yelling at them. And by doing that, you take the steam out of the person who's throwing the hate out. So I apologize for being super fast in what I said. That's normally a 3-hour conversation. I am here afterward. I have nowhere to go immediately, so if we can talk about it some more afterward. But I look forward to everybody's questions.
Thank you, Mr. Saylor. Let me just follow up. I know that you do work with law enforcement, and CARE does. I wonder how the approaches you might take in a conversation with law enforcement might differ from some of the things that you said. You have particular, you're doing training for law enforcement. What do you train them about, and how do you deal with whatever might come up in those sessions?
One of the first and most important things that we have done is after 9/11, there was a industry that arose where people with really no expertise whatsoever were training law enforcement about Islam. So for instance, we have right now one individual who goes around training law enforcement that mosques don't have First Amendment rights, that mosques are barracks, that the former director of the CIA was secretly a Muslim working on behalf of Muslims while he was in office. So one of the first and most important things we do is try to up the standards of law enforcement training, make sure that we are actually getting experts. But when I talk to law enforcement, I come from a law enforcement family. I recognize that what these people do for a living is extraordinarily difficult. But it's also extraordinarily important in that moment not to target someone because you think they might be a terrorist, or because of their racial makeup they might be a criminal, or because of their racial makeup they might be here illegally. You have to target them based on some articulable reason. So when you're trying to, for instance, take down terrorist groups, you're wasting your time if you're just looking at ideology. You have to follow actual criminal leads that can lead to prosecutions. And by going down those paths, you're expending your time in a very useful fashion. So think about it. If you're trying to identify the ISIS person in the United States, just based on what they're saying, it is extremely difficult. It is a needle in a haystack. But if you see somebody selling weapons illegally to groups affiliated with ISIS, then you have an actual criminal investigation to follow. And wouldn't we rather spend our time taking guns away from ISIS than following people based on their ideology, which we may find reprehensible, but there's no way to prosecute under the First Amendment?
Well, that leads me to want to open that same issue and talk a little bit about it with Ms. Song as well, because both of you deal with the idea of keeping the peace and wanting to have cooperation with the same people who are demonized in the minds and in the rhetoric of certain haters. So you have people who are talking about the Islamic religion and the Islamic community and Muslims as being a source of danger, and then law enforcement badly needs the cooperation of Muslims, Muslim community individuals to be their eyes and ears. So how do you bridge that gap? And I'd like to throw it to both to Ms. Song and Mr. Saylor for that set of questions.
I think we have to legitimate and
Pull the
value-
microphone closer to you.
Sure. We have to legitimate and value the interactions we have with any community that is oppressed or besieged or a target of hate crimes, to include the Muslim community. That is why Tamara's role is so vital in our office. We encourage all of our prosecutors to engage that way, but certainly through training and through education, both within and without law enforcement, we just try to enlighten and educate and hope that people build relationships and understand, frankly, that the type of profiling and ill-informed targeting of individuals that Cory described is terrible law enforcement. It is ineffective and potentially bigoted and potentially unlawful for other reasons. So, all we can do is use our station as prosecutors to educate, inform, and train where we can. And we train every police, Pittsburgh police recruit, for example. We'll go anywhere. We went up to Erie and trained, every Erie police officer on civil rights enforcement and bias and hate crimes. So that's our role.
And Mr. Saylor, same idea. When you and your group and individuals in the Muslim community hear that the government, federal or state, is pursuing hate crimes, is active on this front, does that help to make them more comfortable cooperating? Because I know that's been a fraught issue in your community.
I think it's very important, and when I talk to audiences, this is the main point I always make. One, the federal government, state government, local government is a massive entity. So you have to engage your piece of that entity with an open mind. So in some areas we have significant problems with law enforcement, but that doesn't mean we need to deal with all law enforcement from a place of conflict. You have to look at how that particular entity is running itself. I also point out to folks in mosques, look, You may feel uncomfortable because there has been excessive surveillance of our community. We are very aware of the fact that confidential informants have been placed in a number of mosques around the country who actually egged on people to try to get them to do something criminal. And in one case in California, when the community reported that person to the FBI didn't take any action, and a year later we found out we had actually reported the FBI's own confidential informant to them. That makes these conversations difficult. On the other hand, somebody commits an arson against your mosque, it's the FBI, it's law enforcement that are going to come and engage on that. So what we advise institutions to do is you should have an open line of communication with all aspects of government in your area as best as you can, so that everybody sort of knows each other and you have something of a trust relationship when a crisis occurs. That's extremely important. But I will also say we always do advise our community that they have an attorney present with them when they're interacting with law enforcement. And that comes from just an abundance of caution on our part as a civil rights organization, where we have seen too many instances where there were issues, and until we get to know the particular issue, it's just safer to have someone there who's trained in the law, who makes sure that somebody who is in a moment of crisis in their life has someone there whose job it is to protect their rights.
You know, and I can't help but picking up on one thing that you said earlier, the statements that have been made publicly about mosques being places with weapons in them and places with training for violence. If you go back to the 19-teens and the 20s, you will find exactly the same statements were made about Catholic churches. I mean, that's the history, right, Dean Blee? Isn't that true? And so it makes me feel that this is a kind of repeating scenario, that this any particular outgroup is a danger, and therefore we the people who are engaged in this kind of ideology or activity or speech or action, that they repeat these same kinds of things. And that leads me to ask, Dean Blee, with Islamophobia sort of being a more recent thing, is it any different than what we have seen before? Are we seeing the same kind of patterns?
It's quite similar with one odd exception. In general, racist groups are extremely Islamophobic, absolutely. There is one competing narrative in these groups, which is that some white supremacists see Islamic fundamentalists as potential allies against Jewish conspirators. So it's a little bit more complicated and fraught within the white supremacist movement. So I would say, oddly enough, both things are going on full steam. There is some idea that they should model themselves an ally with Islamic fundamentalists, but mostly they're targeting, in the United States in particular and in Europe, Muslims for attack as a victim group.
When you're hating everybody, it does get complicated, doesn't it? Right. Yeah.
And let me just add, one thing that's been very important to note is that because of that past experience, some of the Muslim community's best allies, the Catholic community, the Jewish community, in particular when it comes to states trying to pass anti-Islam legislation, and the Japanese American community, just in terms of the work that was done after the internment of Japanese in World War II, and then the African American communities, you know, the gifts that they have given to all of us are tremendous. Civil Rights Act of 1964 in particular, we use it every day to defend people.
Well, this is a point where I want everybody to begin thinking about what questions they may have, as I have my last few questions for the panel. So if you have a question, why don't you raise your hand? We'll start to get around with the mics, okay? And I guess I do want to ask, as all of you are present here thinking about these things, we've had a number of strategies articulated by Mr. Saylor for individual conversations, which I think are incredibly valuable. What's your best piece of advice for how groups could take this on? How, if you are part of a civil society group, how do you take on organized hate? And Dean Blee can offer an answer from the point of view of her scholarship, Ms. Song perhaps from a prosecutor's point of view, Mr. Saylor from his activism. How do you counter this, thinking about in a group fashion?
So I can start. There's a number of ways outside of legal prosecution that people work very effectively against white supremacists and hate groups. One is purely providing information. That's absolutely key because a number of people, especially young people, are attracted to these groups without really understanding their true agenda. So getting information out about what these groups are and how they might approach young people is very important. It's also important to work on prevention in a different way. These groups target certain kinds of places and institutions for infiltration and to recruit. And the places they target are some police departments, some military services because they want to have weapons training largely, and certain kinds of groups, especially oddly enough, environmental groups have been targeted. So people have been very effective in working with those groups so that they can understand how they might be targeted and what an approach might be. And finally, there are a number of groups who are very effective in working with hate group members or affiliates or fellow travelers in moving out of hate. People don't necessarily become racist and stay racist forever. They can be brought out, but there's very important ways and structured ways that people do it, and a number of groups are very effective in bringing people out of that world.
Ladies first, please.
Okay. I think by the time we're talking about a federal prosecution, you've missed the window for prevention. Prevention obviously is vitally important, but for my seat, once you're talking about a federal prosecution, clearly we want to deter other actors. Clearly we want to use the federal tools that we have sort of sparingly and in a targeted fashion. I should have mentioned that every, for example, hate crime that we file under the Shepard-Byrd Act has to be signed off on by the Attorney General, which tells us two things. First, that it has a very high priority within the Justice Department. It tells you another thing, which is that I don't think they envision that there would be thousands and thousands of these filed throughout the country. It is a targeted surgical tool for particular acts that are particularly heinous that we hope can shine a light on that type of conduct and deter other people. I would say as well, we do the best that we can to identify the contours of a criminal group. So where there really is concert of action, where there really is a conspiracy, where there are people who are either profiting or laundering money to allow themselves to continue to engage in hateful and bigoted and criminal activity, that's our priority, and that's what we would try to accomplish.
So to add on to what I had said earlier, I would just simply ask everybody, don't doubt yourself. Many people that I talk to say, if I get involved, there's not really all that much I can do, or I'm not really good at these kind of things. I would have said the exact same thing when I was a teenager. And yet somehow I've managed to arrive at a point where I've been involved in a number of different actions that had a significant effect on the intent of bigoted and prejudiced groups in the United States. So don't talk yourself out of it is the first and most important thing. The other point that I would keep in mind is this is a struggle of ideas. And I think the ideas that we articulate as a nation are some of the best things that you can use to put forward. Think about it. Our country was not founded, we've made our mistakes, as I've pointed out, but we were not founded for any one religious, racial, or ethnic group. We were founded on a set of ideas, and those ideas have been very attractive to people throughout all time. So when a hate group comes to your campus and wants to do a rally against Muslims, have a similar rally. I wouldn't even have it close by because then everybody argues with each other. But have a similar rally that focuses on positive things and doing good in our community. And that way you offer people a choice. You can go to the hate group, or you can come and hang out with us and be involved in the great idea event that we're hosting. And you will notice people tend to show up in droves at your event. And then you win the media battle because the media goes, here's the 5 guys hating on everybody, and here's the 300 people that showed up at the good event.
Thank you. We're now ready to start questions. As we do that, I just remind everybody that we are ready for questions, not speeches, because we've got great speakers here. So make your questions short enough so we can get around to a lot of other people. Wave your hand for the folks with the mic. Where's our first question?
My question is for U.S. Attorney Sung. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. In your presentation, I was mindful of the absent recognition on this panel of significant critiques of hate crime prosecution, or indeed any strategy based in increases in the amount and severity of incarceration in the United States, by in particular queer and trans of color advocacy groups, including the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, who note this country's policing and prison systems are a major component cause of, indeed are a primary perpetrator of, rather than a solution to violent white supremacy. What, in your opinion, is the primary purpose of seeking long-term imprisonment for hate crimes? And what is your office doing to prevent the significant racist violence perpetrated by police and prison administration officials in federal and, well, I guess in your case, in the federal prison system in the United States? Thank you very much.
You're welcome. The cases that I talked about were hate crimes that were predicated on violence. They were not driven by a desire to mass incarcerate. What I tried to focus on today was when a person is targeted because of the way they look or where we think they're from or who we think they worship, and an act of violence or a homicide is committed, there are federal tools to address that. The sanctions can be severe. The term of imprisonment can be severe. But we're talking about potentially loss of life and grievous assaults in the cases that I highlighted. Clearly, the justice system is not perfect at the state, federal, or local level. We do the best we can to educate and to assure that we have the best laws on the books that we can craft, that the legislature can craft, and then, you know, my role is to try to implement them in a fair way. So that's our mission.
Thank you. Next question. Go ahead.
Right here. My question is aimed particularly at Dean Blee, but I'm sure either or any panelist could speak to it.
Make sure you're speaking up, sir.
Okay.
Thank you.
Do hate groups in particular actually take recognition of hate crime statutes? And if they do take recognition of hate crime statutes, do hate crime statutes act to polarize those groups? Do they act defensively towards the statutes, which then would move the hate group to a more polarized position, which might implicate psychological issues of group polarization, which might exacerbate the hate within that group?
So I would say that they take recognition in the sense that hate groups are interested in terrorizing their target populations, and they take account of hate, of ways to enact hate as a form of terror. So, for example, as things are mentioned in the newspaper, as things that were prosecuted as hate crimes, they will take those up as a form of terror. So if they'll read about swastikas were put on these on a building, or hate messages were written on a mosque, that will spread, will diffuse across the hate movement as a tactic of terror. So they take account, but in kind of a negative way.
Hi, yes. First, I want to thank you all for coming. It was a wonderful speech, and I really enjoyed it. One thing I was wondering is, it's billed as like, this is against hate groups, and I was a little disconcerted that all of the groups mentioned were only white supremacist groups, and I was just wondering why there was no mention of groups such as Antifa. Also, I wanted to ask your opinion on, whenever you were mentioning the 4 factors that you use to define hate groups, a lot of what I've seen from the news and also from interviews with members, I see an argument for how you could classify Black Lives Matter as a hate group under those 4 factors, and I wanted to know your opinion on that. And yeah, like.
Thank you.
So this is a longer conversation, but my specialty is white supremacist groups and how they enact violence. So I'm talking about that landscape of actors, not beyond that, and how they enact violence on behalf of white superiority agenda. So,
equally, I'm paid to look at the anti-Muslim movement. So I'm happy to look at other movements when I have that particular job, but I think it's a function of who you have up here speaking today. At the end of the day, though, the issue is very simple. If someone perpetrates a crime against someone else because of a protected characteristic, whatever that happens to be, that's a hate crime. And I think Sue can make that very clear for us. So it doesn't matter what background they come from or what their motivating factor was. If they act against somebody because of a protected characteristic, we would all call that a hate crime.
I'll just add, I think that's a great question, and I sort of alluded to earlier, one of the most interesting debates I think going on right now is, what label do we put on this conduct, right? I mean, when is it domestic terrorism? When is it a hate crime? In my world, there's a lot of overlap. Why does it matter? Why do we care? Why does it matter what label, politicians or those in power put on certain acts? So I think that we need to look at sort of the panoply of criminal conduct, think about why it may or may not be a hate crime, why domestic terrorism may fit. We look for certain characteristics of domestic terrorism. Are you trying to influence a government or change the laws? Are you trying to oppress or coerce a particular group of people? And I think that those are factors that we see in a number of different things, and who's putting the label on obviously matters.
Next question is right here in the middle.
Hi, my question's for Cory Saylor. I want to thank you for giving us advice about how to talk to people who watch Fox News and are thinking and getting experience from another perspective. But do you actually try to talk to people who think that Jews came from Satan, or that non-whites are not human, or who deny that the Holocaust exists? Because I have no idea how to talk to such a person. I mean, as a scientist, I don't know how to talk to someone so wholly unconnected with reality. And I don't know if you have any advice for that, because I would probably just walk away.
The reality-based community, yes.
So, and you just gave the best advice possible in the room. If you are a person who just simply cannot have a conversation of that nature, and it would anger you so much that you couldn't maintain calm, walk away. Absolutely. But yes, I do. And it's primarily because I'm trying to figure out from our research what works and what doesn't. And so I routinely get called race traitor. I routinely get threats against my person, and of all sorts of interesting and creative fashions. But I find it extremely important to not sit around and just talk to people who agree with me. And one example, I was in Maine at one point in time, and a woman had called the mosque where I was speaking, and she asked if I had made it in before a snowstorm that was happening in Maine. And then she drove 4 hours to be able to sit and talk to me. And when her first question to me was, "Why do you Muslims beat your women?" And my hosts in the room were like, get away from her, let's not talk to her. But what I did is I ended up, answering all the other questions, and I sat down with her for an hour afterward, and I would say that was the most important conversation I had. And I explained to her that, well, actually we don't, and pointed out, look, my wife is from Afghanistan. She lived for a year under the Soviet occupation. She threw rocks at invading Russian soldiers. I guarantee you, if my religion said it was okay to hit her, I would not survive very long, right? This is a very tough person. But by having that conversation with her, I'm able to impact the people who are at the extremes, and hopefully, as we say in Islam, inshallah, God willing, bring them toward the center. Disagree with me by all means, but let's at least have a conversation where we're not going out and targeting each other, where we're at least just yelling at each other, right? So I'm Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, that's no problem. I'll go on and yell at anybody because that's politics. But when we as people in politics and communications mess up, it ends up in Sue's place. And I would rather never have that happen.
Next question is here, and then we'll go over to this side. Go ahead, ma'am.
I have a question of all of you, of each of you. How politically active are these hate groups? Are they conducting voter registration drives? Do you think they do vote? I think maybe a sub-question of mine is, how many of these people, what percentage do you estimate like Trump supporters might be? Thank you.
So I'll start with the more narrow group, which is people who are actually in white supremacist or affiliated groups. They almost never vote. They certainly wouldn't vote in federal elections because most of them believe that the federal government is a Jewish-controlled institution. They call it ZOG, Zionist Occupation Government. So sometimes they'll support candidates local and county level, but never on the federal level. The people I study, which are a subset of what's being discussed here, but these people are not at all interested in electoral politics. They're interested in undermining the state, not being elected to represent the state.
So looking at the group that I study here, many of them are actually quite politically active. When Donald Trump called for a Muslim ban in December 2015, the press release that accompanied that statement cited the Center for Security Policy, a very well-known anti-Muslim group. The poll that was cited there had already been debunked as flawed, but to give you an idea of the Center for Security Policy's thinking, their leader, Frank Gaffney, once said that the presence of a crescent moon in a U.S. military patch, so you know the military has their patches that identify their different services. The presence of a crescent in a U.S. military patch after the inauguration of President Obama was signs of official U.S. submission to Islam, right? Just because there was a crescent moon in it. It was the U.S. Missile Command, which a moon kind of makes sense in their particular patch. But he was cited by Donald Trump. And that poll was conducted for him by Kellyanne Conway. Some of you may have seen her on TV recently. Another group, Act for America, is very involved in voter registration, meetings with elected officials. Bridget Gabriel, the head of that organization, who believes America is at stage 2 Islamic cancer and that Muslims cannot be patriotic American citizens, she was pictured inside the White House, meeting with White House staff this year. So we know that not only are they active in politics, but they're having success in politics.
We have one more question, and then I have some other remarks. Go ahead, sir.
To what extent do you think that prisons breed haters? And if there is a lot of breeding of hate that goes on in prison, are we doing any good sending haters to prison?
That's a very good question. I'll just, take it. My personal experience as a prosecutor for 20 years is that prisons do tend to be very racially stratified. Some of the most pernicious, I'm talking about the Aryan Brotherhood, some of the most pernicious white supremacist violent groups are very active in prison, and some of them maintain their affiliations outside of prison. I think when somebody's killing somebody and inflicting violence and harm, the question is, if not prison, then what? And right now we don't have sort of a host of other good alternatives for someone that is truly a danger to society. But having prisons at least perpetuate, if not exacerbate, the cycle of whatever bias and hate may already be going on with a person is not a good thing for law enforcement or for any of us.
This is a bit of a broad statement, but I will say that in many instances when we've seen mosques vandalized and you find out that it's a bunch of teenagers, for instance, we often ask the prosecutors to not go full force at them, to give them things like community service. So again, recognizing that we're trying to address the whole spectrum of hate crimes in a 30-second statement, there are opportunities to have people go into other paths that can help them to move away from the stereotypes and prejudice that they're starting to push, particularly when they're younger.
Before we break off, which we will shortly, let me ask you if you would help me thank Cory, Julie, and Kim, who helped to put this all together for us. Thank you. Great job. Very good job. And before thanking our panelists, I just want to say something that sort of bubbled up in my head as we were talking. There's a story well documented about a judge named Learned Hand. Now, lawyers, you got to back me up on this. That was really his name, right? Very famous judge in the early part of the 20th century. We study his cases still. And one time in the middle of the century, Judge Learned Hand was called upon to be the speaker at not a Constitution Day event, because there was no such thing at that point, but a ceremony at which new citizens were being sworn in. It was about the closest thing that you would get to something like this. And he gave a very famous set of remarks talking about the Constitution and the law. And I think what sticks with me most is something that I could not help but feel today as I listened to our speakers and I heard your questions and their answers. He said, the law is great, the Constitution, yes, but those are not the things that ultimately protect us. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. So as we celebrate Constitution Day, I want to thank all of you who came, who had in your own hearts that kind of liberty, who are here because you love the law, you love the Constitution, your mind is open, you want to know about what's happening, and it is what is in your heart and the hearts of our speakers that will keep us going along with our great, great Constitution. So why don't you join me in thanking our terrific speakers. Thank you all. We are adjourned.